She's 10 years old, maybe younger, standing in a crowd in ancient Rome, probably holding her mother's hand, not fully understanding what's happening. And then, the most powerful priest in the entire city, the pontifex Maximus, points straight at her. And just like that, her childhood is over. No campaign, no choice, no say in the matter. One second, she's a regular Roman girl. The next, she belongs to the goddess Vesta, to the state, to an empire that will worship her purity and destroy her if she fails. Rome didn't just pick these girls for religion, they picked them to protect the very soul of the Republic. Her body wasn't just hers anymore, it became a symbol of national security. Her chastity, a reflection of Rome's moral strength. And if that sacred flame she guarded ever went out, or if she broke her vow, the punishment wasn't scandal, it wasn't exile, it was something so cold, so calculated, it'll honestly mess with your head. Buried alive, in silence, by the very civilization that claimed to honor her. So why would families hand over their daughters to something that sounds more like sacred imprisonment than divine honor? And how did Rome convince itself this was justice? All right, let's rewind for a second, because that moment when the Pontifex Maximus pointed at her, that wasn't random. It was ritual, calculated, and absolutely final. The selection of a Vestal Virgin, Virgo Vestalis, was one of the most solemn ceremonies in Rome. The girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old, both parents alive, legitimate Roman citizens, no scandals in the family, no physical imperfections. She had to represent this flawless, almost impossible standard of purity. Basically, Rome's version of the ideal daughter. Picture it, a small group of young girls standing together in public, probably confused, maybe scared, families watching, hearts pounding, and then the chief priest either draws lots or directly chooses one. And here's the part that hits hard. Being chosen wasn't always celebrated. Some families cried, not proud tears, dread. Because once she was selected, that was it. No appeals. No, we changed our mind. She was led away in silence. She crossed the Sacra Via, the sacred road, for the last time as a child of her own household. From that moment on, she didn't belong to her father. She didn't belong to her family. She belonged to Vesta, to Rome. And what waited for her next wasn't just religious training, it was 30 years of service inside a world most Romans would never see. Now remember, she's barely 10 years old, and she's already been taken from everything she knows. No going back home, no bedtime stories from her mom, no running through the streets with other kids. That chapter, done. She's brought to the house of the Vestals, the Atrium Vestae, right beside the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, the beating heart of Rome. This wasn't some quiet convent tucked away in the countryside. This was prime real estate. Senators walked nearby. Generals passed through. Emperors would later rule in the shadow of that very flame. And that flame, that was her responsibility.
Her service lasted 30 years. 10 years learning the rituals, memorizing prayers, understanding the sacred laws. 10 years actively performing the duties, guarding the eternal fire, preparing sacred offerings, protecting holy objects tied to Rome's survival. Then 10 years teaching the next generation of girls who would stand exactly where she once stood. But here's what most people miss. This wasn't just religion, it was politics. That flame symbolized Rome's eternal life. If it burned bright, Rome stood strong. If it went out, people panicked. They saw it as a bad omen, like the universe itself was warning them something terrible was coming. And her chastity? That wasn't personal, it was state business. Rome believed her purity reflected the moral health of the entire empire. That's a crazy amount of pressure to put on a child. She wasn't locked behind bars, but make no mistake, those laws were stronger than iron chains. And once she stepped into that world, there was no exit. But here's where things start to feel even heavier, because the most binding rule of all wasn't about the fire,
It was about her body. And this is where it gets real. Because guarding a flame, that's a duty. Learning rituals, that's discipline. But the vow she took over her own body, that was absolute. Before the goddess Vesta herself, she swore 30 years of complete chastity. No marriage, no relationships, no physical contact with men, not even the suggestion of it. And we're talking about a vow made when she was still a child, long before she could even understand what that promise truly meant. This wasn't just religious symbolism. In Rome, her virginity was political infrastructure. The state believed her purity held the empire together. Wars could rage, politicians could scheme, but as long as the Vestals remained untouched, Rome believed the gods were still on their side. That's an insane weight to carry. She was honored, sure. She had privileges other women could only dream of. She could own property, free condemned prisoners with a word, even sit in places of honor at public games. But those privileges came with a silent warning. You were sacred, but you were always being watched. And here's the twist nobody talks about. She was revered in public, but in private, scrutinized. Every movement, every conversation, every rumor. Because if even the slightest mistake happened, if the sacred flame flickered out, if a whisper of scandal reached the wrong ears, Rome didn't shrug it off. Rome punished. And what happened next wasn't symbolic, it wasn't mild, it was calculated, controlled, and shockingly brutal. Now here's the part that feels almost impossible to wrap your head around. She was sacred, but she was never safe. A Vestal Virgin walked through Rome dressed in ceremonial white, honored at festivals, given front.
Let that sink in. The Romans refused to spill sacred blood, so they created a loophole. They wouldn't kill her directly, instead they would entomb her beneath the earth and leave her to die. That way, technically, the state hadn't executed her. They had left her to the gods. One of the most haunting examples happened in 216 BCE. According to Livy, two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were condemned. The trial wasn't public. Whatever defense they gave is lost to history. One took her own life. The other faced the ritual. And the ritual was chilling. No screaming crowds, no dramatic spectacle. She was dressed in white, veiled, barefoot, almost like a bride, led through the Roman Forum in silence. Imagine the weight of that walk, people watching, nobody intervening. The procession stopped at the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked. A chamber had already been dug. Inside, a bed, a lamp, bread, water, milk. Just enough to maintain the illusion that she wasn't being executed, just left underground. She descended the steps, and then they sealed it. Earth, stones, silence. No appeal, no rescue, no second chance. The state insisted it wasn't murder, but when the air ran out, so did she. And what makes this even darker isn't just the punishment, it's what it says about Rome itself. And here's the part that lingers long after the tomb is sealed. Rome never called it murder. By giving her a lamp, a little bread, a splash of water, the state convinced itself it had stayed pure. No blood spilled, no executioner's blade. They told themselves they had simply left her to the gods. But everyone knew the truth. There was no escape hatch in that underground chamber, no hidden mercy. What made it even colder? The silence. There was no public spectacle, no cheering crowd, no dramatic final words recorded for history. That was intentional. Silence was the punishment's final weapon. Once buried, her name faded, her reputation erased. It was as if Rome scrubbed her from memory, the same way you'd wipe chalk off a board. Revered one day, gone the next. And that's the contradiction at the heart of it all. The Vestal Virgins stood at the crossroads of religion, law, and raw political power. They were treated like living symbols of divine favor, icons of purity that supposedly held the empire together. Yet the moment doubt crept in, the machine turned on them with terrifying precision.
It forces a question that still hits today. What does a society